Laurette, a sinister name, evoking scenes of horror, gloomy woods, sunken roads, plateaus and ravines taken and retaken 20 times, where for months, night after night, we cut each other's throats, massacred each other incessantly. We made that little corner of the earth a human charnel house by the criminal obstinacy of our top brass, who knew quite well that nothing decisive would come from this petty style of fighting a war, these nasty little attacks. But they imagined that in this war of attrition, this cruel game, the Germans would be the first ones to be worn down. Je les grignote, I'm nibbling away at them, says paunchy old Joffre, a phrase that the press picks up like a rare pearl, and this futile, bloody offensive dragged on for several months. On June 2nd, 1915, at 8 in the evening, resigned, sullen, without enthusiasm but without useless complaining, we set off for the trenches, which weren't very far off. Travelling a few kilometres from Saint-Zongohel, we arrived at the mining town of Bully-Grenay, which still had almost all its inhabitants, even though it was close to the front line of trenches. The mine still operated, thanks to the Boches, who no doubt didn't want to destroy it so they could make use of it later. But the area around the train station and the road we headed down were often bombarded. After a few hundred more metres, we reached the nearly deserted village of Aix-Noulette, the last vestige of civilization. From here on, all was desolation. At the entrance to Aix, we followed a large boyau, which led us to a branch of a sunken road near the little ruined village of Noulette. We had to stay here for 3 days, in reserve. This was no doubt to get us used to the cannon's roar, the musty smell of rotten flesh, the fat venomous flies, the ticks, the worms, the rats, everything unclean and impure that swarms and flourishes in a charnel house. Along the embankment of the sunken road, the engineers had carved dugouts covered with sheets of iron, each meant to hold a dozen men at most, but where 40 of us were piled up. Of course, you couldn't lie down, or hardly even crouch down with your legs curled up, and you couldn't move without provoking howls of complaint from your neighbours. You couldn't get out of this stuffy hole without stepping on feet, legs and knees, and what little air there was inside was poisonous. It was hot enough to hatch chickens in there. To make things worse, legions of fleas and ticks climbed up the straw, which covered the floor and onto our legs, our arms, our backbones, leading to uncontrollable itching. And to think that before the war, I pitied the poor gypsies who camped outside our village. I won't feel sorry for them anymore, no matter how shabby their wagons might be. Their fate is enviable compared to what we went through. But why, one might ask, didn't you go outside to be more comfortable? Well, sure. An accursed German battery had sighted its 105s right on this road, in enfilade. If someone ventured outside, even hugging the embankment, it would unleash a blast from a 105 and sometimes a volley. These gunners weren't stingy with their shells. Even without any strollers on the deserted road, they would toss a few shells over, just to remind us how vigilant they were, always ready to yank the lanyards. During the day, a shell hit the entrance to the bunker next to ours, wounding 5 soldiers, 1 mortally. That night the German guns ceased firing, so we were put to work on various tasks. I got the order to take my squad and dig some latrines, deep along the embankment of the road. Captain Hudel came to see us and told us not to take this ridiculous task as a joke, and that we needed to be finished with it by dawn. But it won't be 48 hours before these latrines are filled up by shell fire, I said, and they're too far from the dugouts. Guys will want to go somewhere closer, in a shell hole. It doesn't matter, said Hudel. It's an order. If it's not finished by tomorrow morning, you'll keep working on it in the daylight. It must be that old cow Commandant Nadeau who gave that order, said the ravitailleur, rationer Therese. The smarter they seem, the stupider they turn out to be, said the gravedigger candidate of Périac, Geordie. You know the fable of the animals who were sick with the plague, said the schoolteacher Mondes. Well, our bosses won't all die of it, but they'll all get sick, not with the plague, but with stupidity. As for me, I'm not lifting a shovelful of dirt, he added. A sergeant came and requisitioned 3 men from me to take some materials up to the front line. They came back in the daytime, exhausted. Then I had to supply a man to go help a sailor posted in the woods with a Gatling gun. Laurette from Situ volunteered for this mysterious mission. At midnight, Therese, escorted by his sidekick Erix, headed off with his food containers and his portable kitchen for Aix. You'll understand that the work on these latrines hadn't made much progress by the time the protective nocturnal darkness began to dissipate, so we prudently made our way back to our stuffy hole. An hour later, a sergeant appeared. "Corporal Barthas, take your squad and finish the latrines immediately." "Is it the captain who gave you this order?" "Yes, because the commandant insists that the work be finished." 1. The whole squad groaned. "Well, Sergeant, I refuse to risk human lives for such a ridiculous, unimportant task." The sergeant left, fuming. 5 minutes later he came back, even more in a rage. The captain, when he heard about my refusal, had ordered the sergeant himself to make my squad finish up those damned latrines, sending men out 2 by 2, taking turns. The sergeant forced me to pick out the first 2 from the 13th squad. They were the 2 Periacoa, Allard and Gills, who refused right away, arguing that they were sick. Under threat of being sent immediately to the care of that angel of death, the medical officer Torres, they took up their picks and shovels to continue their latrine digging. But soon the shells started falling on the road, and they dropped their tools and rejoined us in the shelter. For the rest of the day they didn't bother us anymore about those latrines, and for good reason. We had to leave that very evening for the front lines, to relieve some units which had been sorely tested. That was why our reserve duty was cut short. Before leaving, I went to shake the hand of the Periacois Joseph Jams, who was in the 22nd Company, occupying armoured shelters like our own. I didn't see him again, as he was wounded the next day. At 9 at night we left this suffocating, lousy hellhole with few regrets, and made our way to an even worse place. But you could say that our section was privileged, because we went up there in reserve. Right away we found ourselves in a forest of cut-down, twisted, uprooted trees. In this inextricable mess we could barely follow the trace of what looked like a communication trench. Suddenly a volley of shells struck the woods with a frightful racket. Clutching the ground, trembling with fear, we were sure that our final hour had come, all the more because right in front of us we heard the cries and moans of wounded men. It was like being in a calm in the midst of the most furious storm. Why not take advantage and flee? How long the minutes are in times like these. Finally, after having gone back and forth more than 10 times about why we weren't going forward, we resumed our march. 100 meters farther, still in the woods, we relieved the section which had been waiting impatiently. Right when they were leaving, shells exploded above our heads, and one of their men was killed outright. Our section, just arriving, already had 6 wounded. They advised us to watch carefully, to not shoot, to not even speak, so as not to reveal our positions, and to hide ourselves completely by day. That's what you call being in reserve, lost in the woods and surrounded by Boche on all sides. We spent the night without incident, crouched in hiding behind the trunks of fallen trees. At dawn we ceased our vigils. Everyone sought out a hole, a shelter, a refuge in which to hide. We let the cannons do the talking. Why are we wandering around like this, far from any help, in a wood occupied by the Germans? Scattered like we were, a Boche sergeant with 4 men could have rounded us up as easily as scooping up snails. Along a small slope we found 2 shelters, side by side, made from tree limbs and planks, in which the 13th Squad had found refuge. Pretty miserable shelters, which kept out the sunlight and the man-eating flies. That day, June 5th, was one of the bloodiest days of this futile Battle of Artois. The French communiqué of the following day claimed that our artillery had fired 500,000 projectiles. I can speak for those who lived through that hell when I say that the German artillery gave us back just as many. 1 million cannon rounds in 24 hours, on just a few square kilometers of territory. Of this fantastic number of shells of every caliber, maybe 50,000 or 100,000 fell right in the woods where we were. Explosions filled the air without ceasing. Strange, sharp, piercing sounds. First the whistling, sometimes like a cat meowing, then crashing down like a steady rain of steel. We stayed for the whole stifling June day, flattened out next to each other, with spirits numbed, our brains gripped with extreme nervous tension. From time to time, from shelter to shelter, we called out to each other, asking if anyone was wounded. It's truly a miracle that in the midst of this avalanche of iron, none of us had the slightest scratch. No matter how skeptical you might be, it's times like this that make you wonder if some mysterious supernatural force isn't watching over us. My memory of this day is spotty, and I have only a few vague recollections of it. First of all, a dead French soldier a few steps away from us. Lying on his back, he looks like he is sleeping. This sight bothered us, and in spite of the danger, Allard went out to throw a blanket over the body. A moment later, a huge explosion, right nearby, woke us up from our torpor. A shell had just dug an enormous hole, exhuming a corpse and blasting it into pieces, which immediately drew thousands of ravenous flies. Oh, those flies from the Laurette charnel house, which reached back way behind the front lines. What intense disgust they inspired among all of us. They got into everything, canteens, mess kits, pots and pans, swarming incessantly all around us, whether we were alive or dead, like bees going from flower to flower. At twilight there was a slight let-up. We hadn't seen each other since morning. What has happened to our comrades? We hear the voice of our young Sergeant Dals calling us. We have to hoist our packs and follow him. We're rejoining the company. There's nothing to bother us anymore. Under our own artillery fire, the Boches have abandoned the woods, which I'm told later is called the Bois Carré, square woods. I wasn't able to appreciate its geometric shape, whether it was square, round, or rectangular. The fellow who guided us said that, at 3 p.m, our 21st Company had attacked, with Captain Hudel at the head of the troops. The Germans, from the Imperial Guard, if you please, were as stunned as raw recruits, and 32 of them were taken prisoner, while others scrambled away from the Frenchmen bursting into their trenches. We struggled to keep up with the sergeant, but it wasn't easy. No natural cataclysm could have wreaked the frightful chaos which we saw in those gloomy places. We left the woods and entered a labyrinth of communication trenches, filled up in many places by shell blasts. Suddenly, without warning, a couple of timed fuse shells burst right over our heads. Sergeant Dals had an arm pierced by shrapnel. Streams of blood gushed out of it, and he ran off howling, out of his mind. Our guide, also wounded, disappeared too. We were left to wander aimlessly through the deserted trenches. We came across the body of a fellow from our company, trampled to death, I learned the next day, by a gang of cowards barreling through the trenches in a mad panic. At nightfall, we rejoined the company. Standing in the middle of the trench, Captain Hudel, victor over the Imperial Guard, conqueror of the Fond de Buval, crowned with glory, stopped us. I was about to shake his hand and congratulate him, but in a dry voice he said to us, "Where are you going like that?" "But isn't it by your order that we've come up here?" I said, puzzled. "Not at all," he replied in a lousy mood. "Who brought you here?" "Sergeant Dals, but he was wounded on the way here and took off. Or what the hell. Since there's a misunderstanding, we'll rejoin our section." Since there weren't any more Germans in the wood, I was thinking, that will make for a quiet night in comparison. "Not so fast," said the captain, annoyed. "Stay here, there's work to do. Tonight you're going to dig a communication trench to link this trench to the one we've taken, so that tomorrow, you hear, we can move around these trenches without being seen." So we went to work, but what an awful night it was. The bombardment continued, as heavy as that during the day. We were dazed, blinded by the lightning flashes of cannons and shells. Maybe 100 times that night we threw ourselves to the ground when shellfire spattered around us. What a contrast! Such a storm in the midst of calm, of the serenity of a glorious summer night. Daybreak. The sun rises, indifferent to the field of horror. Everywhere we see nothing but cadavers and shapeless human remains, pasturage for the rats which were more courageous than the crows, whose fear kept them away. Captain Hudel didn't look very happy about our work, even though one could move along the trench at a crouch without being seen. He urged me to continue the work, but I maintained that the men were literally exhausted by what they had just accomplished, and he didn't insist. "Anyway," I said to him, Neither Poincaré nor General Joffre is going to be coming to the Fond de Buval trench today. That afternoon, an ugly rumour ran along the trench. At 3 p.m, the 21st Company was going on the attack once more. In the face of energetic protests from our captain, who claimed that his men were exhausted, Commandant Nadaud came up to the front line, his pipe in his mouth and his cane in his hand. With a map before him, he asked, "Where is this trench that you took yesterday?" "It's right here. You're standing in it," replied Hudel. Squinting at the map, the commandant said, "I thought you had gotten farther than that. Today you must get up there on that crest. Let's go, Hudel. I'm ordering you to do it." Real courage for a leader isn't blindly executing every order that's given to him. It's refusing to execute that order when his conscience tells him to save human lives from being sacrificed uselessly. In a calm but firm voice, our captain declared that he wasn't going to make his men advance, having asked a supreme effort from them the day before. It was another company's turn to attack today. During this confrontation, a frightful bombardment opened up, and a shell falling right onto the trench wounded Captain Hudel in the shoulder and Commandant Nadaud in the thigh. At the commandant's orders, just one section had gone over the top, out of the trench, but it was immediately hit by machine gun fire, and those who survived had to flatten themselves in shell holes until nightfall. 2. At 2:45, our section chief, Lieutenant Cole, had us hoist our sacks and make ready to head for the front line, 50 metres away, once the attack was launched. Up ahead were the shock troops. Our job, in the second wave, was pursuit. We noticed that Sergeant Baruteau was missing. "I know where he is," I said to the lieutenant. "Go get him." I was told. I had spotted him a little bit to the rear, stretched out in a little shelter, a niche in the sandbags. He was sleeping like a baby. I grabbed his shoulder and gave him a shake, saying, "How can you think of sleeping at a time like this? We're about to attack. We've hoisted our packs and the commandant is right there." Sergeant Baruteau got up, pale, haggard, like a condemned man whom the warden is awakening the morning of his execution. In fact, he could see himself in front of a court-martial and a firing squad for hiding at the moment of attack. We were hurrying back to our section when, from a communication trench to our right, a stampede of shirkers from a neighbouring regiment made us turn back, like it or not. They were shouting wildly, "The Boches are here! They're coming!" Right at this moment, the cannon fire seemed to have reached its paroxysm, which made their terror even worse. Panic is contagious. Followed by Sergeant Baruteau, I fled with all the speed that my long legs could muster. Soon I was exhausted, out of breath, and I had to stop. But the memory of my trampled comrade the day before spurred me on to the extreme limit of my strength. We passed through a connecting trench where individual holes had been dug in the side walls. I stuffed myself into one of them, and the sergeant did the same. The many shirkers passed by and lost themselves in the woods where we had been the day before, and several were killed or wounded by shell fire. I was very surprised not to see the Germans right on their heels, but this was just a mindless panic which, for some of the shirkers, had its epilogue in a court-martial. A corporal from our company got as far as Bethune, where he was arrested. The judges were willing to attribute his conduct to a momentary lapse of reason, and he got off with a light sentence. Less fortunate was a soldier from our regiment, who hid for several days in the Bois de Noulette. He was condemned to death and legally murdered by 12 French bullets at Bully-Grenet. It was said out loud that, for the case of this unfortunate trooper, the judges were inclined to be indulgent, but our odious new captain, Monsieur Croix-Mérevielle, from Carcassonne, acting in the function of police chief, demanded the strict application of the military code. But I don't have any proof of this, since the public wasn't admitted to this parody of justice. Meanwhile, we weren't without worries about what might come from our own absence at the time of an attack, and we quickly rejoined our section, when along the route, or rather along the trench, we met up with an unfortunate fellow who had gone mad and was being carried by 4 of his comrades. Oh, those haggard eyes, that convulsed, terrified, grimacing face, which had lost all human expression. What horrible scenes had those eyes seen, so that madness invaded the brain? To live in such a frightful nightmare, is that where we were all going to end up? We rejoined our comrades, who still had packs hoisted and bayonets fixed, awaiting specific orders to move up. At this moment, a ravitailleur arrived with 2 jerrycans of hooch to give out immediately. Each of us held out our canteens, but many sniffed at it with distrust. This unexpected distribution just before an attack appeared suspicious. Geordie declared that, "This smells like a pharmacy," and Tort from rear said, "It's ether." Mondes watered the ground with the contents of his canteen. "It's poison," he shouted angrily. "They want to make us crazy, but for 2 sous worth of Niol hooch, they're not going to make a killer out of me. But here's a runner from the front lines, dispatch in hand. We assail him with questions. "What's going on? Have we attacked?" "Yes," he gasped. "I think we went out, but the captain and the commandant are wounded. I'm on my way to the first aid station to get a medic." Hearing these words, I threw my pack on the ground and ran toward the front line to find out how seriously my friend Hudel was wounded. In the trench, I met a soldier from the company who was dragging along a wounded man. "What the hell are you going to do up there in the trench? It's terrible." They told me. I kept running, but before getting there, I ran right into Captain Hudel himself, who was heading to the first aid post with the help of Caporal Fourier, Quartermaster Corporal Faury. His jacket had been torn in many places by shell fragments, and blood flowed from his left shoulder. In a few words, he sketched out the scene which I described above, his clash with the commandant, who, wounded in the thigh, couldn't leave the trench. I offered to accompany him to the first aid station, but he told me not to bother, since his wound didn't appear to be serious. "You'll come back to the 280th, I said to him. "Yes," he promised. "I'll do whatever I can." But he wouldn't come back. Once healed, he rejoined the 80th Regular Infantry Regiment. Besides, at the first aid station, he met our Colonel Pujal, who told him brutally, "Well, you're wounded, you're lucky, you're going to a battalion of chasseurs à paille." That would teach our captain for punishing men who missed a roll call to go to Easter Mass, for being so bold as to celebrate the 1st of May, for wanting too much to keep his men alive. Before leaving, Captain Hudel paid 100 francs for an extra ration of wine for the men of his company. Saddened to take leave of my friend Hudel, I reached the trench which the Imperial Guard had held just a day ago. Yes, it was horrible. Let's say, first of all, that it didn't look at all like a trench. Daily bombardments had turned it into a volcanic crevasse, a gaping fissure in the earth, very deep in certain spots, very wide or narrow in other places. There were even places where you couldn't see any trace of a trench anymore. Where the connecting trench joined in, an unfortunate fellow was stretched out, decapitated by a shell, just as if he'd been guillotined. Beside him, another was frightfully mutilated. I took a couple of steps to the left. I saw, as if hallucinating, a pile of corpses, almost all of them German, that they had started to bury right in the trench, which had been made quite wide at this point. At the entrance to the connecting trench, leaning on the slope, was a young German who looked like he was asleep. There was no visible wound. Death had brushed him with its wing and preserved the smile which still marked his youthful face. "There's no one here but the dead," I exclaimed. Retracing my path, I headed to the right, where I finally found some living souls with haggard eyes, leaning on each other in 3s and 4s like frightened beasts, silent, not even looking around. They seemed indifferent to the fierce cannonades, which hadn't ceased. But what is this? Has hell opened up under our feet? Are we right at the rim of a furious volcano? The trench is filled with flames, with sparks, with bitter smoke. The air is unbreathable. I hear hissing, crackling, and alas, yes, the cries of pain. Sergeant Verges has scorched eyes. At my feet, 2 miserable creatures are rolling on the ground, their clothes, their hands, their faces on fire like human torches. And in the trench, everything is on fire. Blankets, tent cloths, sandbags. The Germans had just fired some sort of incendiary liquid on us. What's more, a pack of signal fuses has just ignited, and that's what's causing the most noise, the most sparks, the most smoke. My 2 arms protecting my face, I flee from this hell, my senses completely overturned. I rejoin my squad. They tell me that my eyes stared vacantly, wildly, and that I spoke incoherently, but that didn't last, and I quickly got out of it. Lieutenant Cole sent us up to reinforce the front line. My squad took a position on the right of the communication trench, and another one was on the left. At the middle of the place we occupied, sitting up against the slope of the trench, was our Commandant Nadaud, wounded in the thigh. He looked like he was really suffering. He didn't say a word. 3. The medical officer Executioner Torres had decreed that the stretcher-bearers wouldn't come to fetch any wounded from our trench, even at night. It was too dangerous, too bad for anyone who fell. He'd be lucky if he had a devoted friend to carry or drag him to the first aid station. Lucky, too, if he had a good comrade to staunch his wound, because you wouldn't find a nurse or a medic there to do it. For the commandant, and for him alone, a medic came up to do a quick dressing. I have to say that before he left, he took the time to look at the other wounded around him. Then he headed off, promising the commandant that he would come back to get him as soon as night fell. Commandant Nadaud was detested by his men, so his sad fate left them indifferent. Nobody paid any attention to him. Only Sergeant Four, consumed with ambition for an adjutant's stripe, made any effort for him, no doubt in hope of getting compensated for it. He pulled blankets from packs to make the wounded man more comfortable, once the commandant fainted. The sergeant asked if anyone had any peppermint schnapps or eau de mélisse, non-alcoholic lemon and orange-flavoured drink. No one answered. Furious, the sergeant dug through packs and confiscated a flask of schnapps from Geordie. Geordie, whom, not a week earlier at Houdain, the commandant had wanted to throw into prison for a week for not having jumped to salute him quickly enough. That night, the medic and 2 stretcher-bearers came and took the commandant away. While the bearers were putting him onto the stretcher, the medic, visibly frightened, crouched down next to me in a sharp angle of the trench. "What are those smaller explosions right nearby?" he asked. "Those are grenades which the Boches are throwing at us. They're hiding in shell holes." "The hell they are," said the medic, less and less reassured. "And that's pretty dangerous, isn't it?" "We've had a few wounded by grenades. Rives almost had his head taken off by one." That's Rives, the road worker from Mascabard. The medic didn't want any more of this, and he urged the stretcher-bearers to get moving. I'm not sure if he even waited for them. He had asked me for someone to hold up the wounded man. I had given him Gabriel Gills, the strongest of the squad, and I told him under my breath, "Take your time, don't hurry back, find a hole somewhere and stick yourself in it. As long as you're back here by daylight, that's fine." In fact, he didn't reappear until dawn. As for the commandant, he died the next day. "Good riddance," said the ravitailleur Therese. That was his funeral prayer. A few days later, the medic who had come to take care of Commandant Nadaud was decorated with the Croix de Guerre for going to the aid of a wounded officer under fire. That was fine, but it is worth noting that the medic was following orders. And if he got a Croix de Guerre for staying such a brief moment in this trench, what did those who actually took that trench deserve to get, not to mention those who had to live there, work and fight there day and night? This was a tragic night. Bombs and grenades rained all around us. We could hardly answer back, because we had only a very small supply of these devices, and not many of us knew how to throw them. There were continual alerts, true or false, and an excessive waste of cartridges. All this to kill nothing more than a rat, since I don't think we were dealing with more than a handful of daring Boches who had crept up to throw bombs at us. One moment, Tort from Rieux called out to me in a half-crazed voice, "Barthus! There's a Boche heading toward us there, a few steps away." Indeed, despite the darkness, I could make out a man bounding toward our trench from one shell hole to another. He was no doubt coming to toss some grenades right at us. Instinctively, Tort and I fired our rifles at this character who could have only the worst intentions for us. But in the darkness we couldn't aim properly and we missed him. He could have at least taken fright and turned tail. But no, at 2 paces from us he stood up, his bayoneted rifle at full length, and launched himself right into the trench between Tort and me. We were dumbfounded. But what a surprise! This wasn't one of Goethe's compatriots. It was a soldier from our company, Del Sol, from Homps. He explained to us that he had been part of the platoon which had gone out on patrol. He had to wait in a shell hole until it was dark. Then he tried to reach our lines, lost his way, and reached our trench by chance, where he almost got himself shot or skewered by us. About midnight the cry went up, "To arms!" It looked like the Boches were counterattacking to retake this fine trench for the Kaiser. As for me, I didn't see a thing, but all of us blasted away pell-mell from the edge of the parapet. The guy next to me, Argence from Quillan, had his wrist shot through right when he was firing. The blood spurted out like a fountain and I was covered in it. The wounded man thought he was a goner and started to scream bloody murder. I yanked off his cravat and squeezed it around his arm as hard as I could. The hemorrhaging stopped and he was able to reach the first aid station. I don't think he exaggerated when he said later on, in a letter home, that I had saved his life. Lying stretched out on the ground at our feet, moaning and unrecognizable, were the two soldiers we had seen in flames. Their skin was completely black. One died that night. The other, delirious, sang the songs of his childhood, conversed with his wife and his mother, spoke about his village. Hearing this, we all had tears in our eyes. "They're worse than murderers," cried an anonymous voice in the dark. "To let these guys die without giving them a bit of care." "Ah, if we weren't all cowards," said a well-known voice, that of Therese. "Those who wanted this war would be here in our place. Then we'd see." "It's too late now," I chimed in. "It's before things start that we need people to see clearly. Let's hope that those who get out of this will remember that at least." "And you," said Ferry to me, "you who are writing about the life we're leading here, don't hide anything. You've got to tell it all." "Yes, yes, everything, everything. We'll be there as your witnesses. Maybe we won't all die here," added the others. "They won't believe us," said Mondes, "or maybe they won't even give a damn." In vain we put the dying man alongside the trench wall so he wouldn't get trampled. He kept rolling right into the middle. Worn down by fatigue and the need to sleep, I slumped down for a moment. I was leaning on the dead man, and the dying man was leaning on me. I slept between a corpse and a near corpse. It didn't bother me at all. In the face of certain trials, the heart loses all sensation. I was pulled from my sleep by the arrival of a soldier from another company, who was looking for his brother who, someone had told him, had been killed. Leaning over the burned soldier, he couldn't tell if it was his brother. "Joseph, Joseph, answer me. It's Pierre, your brother, calling you." But it was in vain. He was speaking to someone who had lost his mind. The company no longer had any officers. The only one left, Sub-Lieutenant Cole, had just missed being buried alive by a shell which filled up the trench where he'd been crouching. With much effort, very badly bruised, he dug himself out of the sandbags which had collapsed all around him. Unfortunately for him, he didn't have the slightest scratch, and he hadn't lost a drop of blood. Here's how it was for him. You're squashed flat as a herring, all your ribs are broken, and you don't even get a look of pity. But your skin gets a little scrape, and you lose a few drops of blood, not enough to fill a thimble. Then you're a hero, a martyr. You've paid your debt to the fatherland. You're crowned with glory and honour. The colonel frowned when he heard about Sub-Lieutenant Cole's mishap, and he suspected that he faked this accident. So Cole had to stay in the trench at the Fond de Bouval. The next day they took his command away and transferred him to another battalion. The fate of the 21st Company was now in the hands of Adjutant Caminard. He was an old lifer of a non-com, a hard-bitten maniac who had just earned his lieutenant's stripes that very night. Revolver in hand, he blocked the way of anyone who was seized with the understandable desire to escape from the trench. He did such a good job, and kept us so busy, that he scared off any desire on the part of the Germans to try to retake the trench by a surprise attack. Thanks to him, all the wounded were evacuated. At the first aid station, the medical officer Executioner Torres shouted, "But they're just bringing me dead bodies. Dead bodies. Don't bring me any more." Fine words for the wounded to hear. When Caminard heard about this, he said he would send Torres even more dead bodies, to make him even madder. By daybreak, all we had left in the trench was the blackened, unknown soldier, still delirious. But the cool of the morning must have calmed his fever because he was almost quiet. The mess crew brought coffee, and we savoured it with delight, when the dying man called out to us, "And what about me? Aren't you going to give me any?" We all looked at him, dumbfounded. We expected him to step over into the next world at any moment, and then we would toss his body over the parapet. And here he is, claiming his share of juice. He drank 3 mugfuls, and also had a slug of hooch, which livened him up a bit. I ran up to Adjutant Caminard, who, thinking that I was making a break for it, levelled his revolver at me. "Hey, no kidding," I said, and I told him about this resurrection. He assigned 4 men to carry the poor devil to Torres. I don't know what became of him. June 7th was rather calm compared to the days before. First came some good news. We were going to be relieved the next night. Then the bad news. We had to attack at 3 in the afternoon. "That will be an attack by ghosts," said Mondes. In fact, we looked like ghosts, haggard, ragged, skin the colour of dirt, worn out by several nights without sleep, by tough work details, by the anguish which gnawed at all of us, by bad food, by thirst which burned our gullets. Yes, we looked like ghosts who had risen from the grave. Sure, the cooks and ration squads did their best to bring us decent food. But try eating a square meal when the air is polluted with the odour of rotting flesh from the hundreds of cadavers which surrounded us, putrefying in the hot June sun. Almost all of us wore a strip of cloth with a little sack of camphor under our noses and a handkerchief in front of our faces to keep the flies away. You'll understand how we gulped down our food and swilled our drinks. All we asked for was some kind of beverage, or just plain water. And this last day we had a nice surprise. With great effort and at much danger to themselves, moving around in the open, they brought each section a keg of beer. As a barrel maker, I was assigned the task of tapping our keg, and finally we were really able to quench our thirst. As for the announced attack, it didn't take place. Our bosses realized, just in time, that our strength in numbers was insufficient for us to have any chance of success. That consideration alone is what made up their minds. Finally, to our great joy, our relief was announced for 9 o'clock that evening. At the appointed hour, and even before, we were as ready as we could be, but all through the night no one showed up to relieve us. Caminade was furious. He sent runner after runner, but no one could find any trace of the other battalion of the 280th, which was supposed to replace us. Finally, at dawn, just when we were beginning to give up hope, our replacements, who had gotten lost and wandered around all night, arrived to deliver us. We didn't go far, about a kilometre back from the front line, to a place called the Fosso Lou, Wolves' Ditch. It was nothing more than a wide, steep-sided stretch of road, which the German artillery spotters hadn't yet fixed their sights on. Indeed, when you left the furnace of the Fond de Bouval, any place would seem like a garden of delights. All the same, exposed to a scorching sun, without any shelter, you couldn't miss the fact that the slightest comfort was lacking. When we complained that there weren't any shelters for us to sleep in, Caminard mocked us, saying, "My little ones, here the nights aren't made for sweet dreams. I've already gotten my orders. We're on work detail every night." Caminade could make fun of us all right. At the end of the road there was a nice dugout where he could snore away to his heart's content. That's what they call being at rest. Each night we went out with our picks and shovels through artillery barrages to repair the day's damage to the trenches caused by shell fire. It was convicts' work, and we grumbled about it, but someone had to do it. At all cost we had to maintain the trenches leading up to the front lines, so that the ration squads, stretcher-bearers and relief units could get through. To encourage us, they told us that soon we'd be heading to the rear for some real rest. But once again they were deceiving us. On June 11th at nightfall, we headed back up the road toward the sinister Fond de Bouval. This time we were a few hundred metres to the left toward Angres. We didn't gain much from this shift in position. We were in the same hellhole. At night we stayed in squads at the forward listening posts. By day, due to the violent bombardments, we left only a few sentries at the front line, and each squad went to safe ground as best it could, fleeing the shell fire like hunted animals. On June 13th, at dawn, the 13th Squad had just spent the night at the front line, repairing an earth slide, and we had just installed ourselves in a rather deep stretch of the communication trench. We didn't have anything to do until evening, when we would have to go back to our ditch digging on these roads to Calvary, or occupy some listening post at the farthest limit of our lines. Around us was complete solitude. Frightened by the number of our casualties, the bosses now left only a few scattered squads in the forward zone, simply to provide surveillance, abandoned to whatever our fate might be. The men of Squad 13, after having ditched all their gear, set about writing, reading, sewing. A few had already stretched out and dozed off, when suddenly a couple of shells exploded nearby. We didn't pay them much attention. "Here come the wake-up snacks again," someone said. In a brief instant, new explosions, this time closer at hand. Like beasts who sniffed danger in the air, some of us stood up right away. We knew that these weren't your cheap, run-of-the-mill shells, but perhaps 150s, just one of which, well aimed, could wipe out our whole squad. 3 or 4 minutes passed, and then in the distance we could hear the dull thuds, like the sound of a gong, of shells being shot from their cannons, which then landed loudly about 80 meters from where we were, a few seconds later. Had some German artillery spotter found us and pointed us out to his idle gunners? It's possible. Our opinions were split. Some wanted to get out right away. Others thought that here at the end of the trench we were safe. But throughout the course of this war I had, on many occasions, a mysterious intuition, an instinct about the imminence of danger. At this very moment, from the very bottom of my being, a voice told me that it was time to flee. "Everybody pick up your gear and get ready to move out. Stand up, get a move on." I cried out to those who didn't answer my first appeal. I had never given orders with such vehemence. Seeing that the whole squad was ready, I waited for the next sound of firing. It arrived like thunder, then the shells crashed down 30 meters from us. Chunks of stone, of iron, of earth whistled over our heads. Great vaults of black smoke obscured the sunlight. No doubt they were after us. They were doing us quite an honor. "Head to the right," I shouted. "Save yourselves! Hurry up! Let's go! Move out!" Like the captain of a sinking ship, I had to be the last one to leave. When you accept a promotion, even as slight as that of corporal, you have to accept the responsibility and step up to the task at hand, even at the risk of your own life. My friends Gills and Allard yelled to me as they fled, "Mondes doesn't want to come. Go get him." The school teacher from Pepieux was at the other end of the squad. In 3 bounds I was on him. Tort was still there, urging him one last time to follow us. When I appeared, Tort took off. Mondes, hunched over, was quietly writing a letter, just as calm as if he were at his desk in the schoolroom, in front of his class. It seemed to mean nothing to him that a battery of heavy-caliber guns had trained their sights on him. "Well, you're crazy, Mondes," I said to him. "You want to get yourself blown to pieces." "What the hell?" he said. "Maybe you'll get killed where you're going." "No," I begged him. "They've been moving steadily in this direction each time they fire. The next one is right in line with the one before. It'll land right here. Come on." Mondes shook his head and continued to write. Right across from him crouched a soldier from the other squad, the 14th, which formed the half-section with ours. He was called Lafont, from Cavanac. A tailor, he was sewing his overcoat. Why, for his own sake, hadn't he followed his own squad instead of staying with us? I have no idea. I asked him if he didn't want to follow us. "No," he said. "If Mondes stays, I stay." In the face of such stubbornness, I had to save my own skin. Already the others, dragging their gear bent double, were out of danger. I had hardly gotten 60 meters when I heard the frightful detonation of the shell, which landed right where we had been. I barely had time to hit the ground, to avoid the blast of the explosion. Then, getting up, I bolted for the spot where the squad had stopped. A few more salvos landed, and then the Boches turned the mouths of their cannon elsewhere. The habitual cannonade lit up the crests. The ravines and the woods were filled with whiffs of black, grey, greenish and white smoke, which mixed as they floated up in the air, and made an increasingly opaque fog, forming a halo around the sun. The layers of air were shaken by 100 thunderclaps sounding at once, and in the midst of this rumbling you could distinctly hear the shells bursting in the Fond de Bouval, resonating like a death knell which echoed through the ravines. But after a while you ignore it, and there were those who slept, snoring away, dreaming to the sound of this infernal music. The shells had to be landing right next to you before you would get excited about them. Meanwhile, we were very worried about what had happened to our comrades Mondes and Lafont. As for me, I reproached myself for not having the willpower and the energy to make them follow us. Nevertheless, my conscience couldn't really hold me to blame, but they could be lying wounded out there, needing our help. I asked for a volunteer to come with me. Erix from Narbonne stepped forward. He was illiterate, and Mondes had written his letters home to his family. With pick and shovel, we made our way back to the place from which the shells had chased us. When we were 20 paces from it, we found a musette bag torn to shreds, with only a notebook intact inside. It belonged to Mondes, the only memento of his which I could send to his family. As for the place where Mondes had been, the trench was completely filled in. In spite of the risk of being spotted by the Germans, we excavated a bit and uncovered a boiled, shriveled head and a kepi which, by its distinctive shape, we recognized to be that of Mondes. With big drops of sweat rolling off our foreheads, our limbs trembling with emotion, Erix and I threw a couple of shovelfuls of earth onto this head out of which all the life and intelligence had been so brutally torn, leaving behind just a shapeless mass. For some time, Mondes had a premonition of his fate. The very day before, he had written a despondent letter to his family, we learned later on. Private Lafont, buried by the same shell, was pulled out that evening by his own squad. His body showed no trace of the slightest wound. He had been struck down by the concussion of the blast. Night having fallen, the 13th Squad went to work digging out the body of Mondes and burying it properly. But hardly had we gotten this done when we were called to man a forward listening post. An engineer team arrived just then to put the trench back into shape. We asked them to watch out for our comrade, but they didn't pay any attention. Instead, they thought it proper to dig right alongside, so that the next morning, when we came back, we saw that they had piled up on top of the body all the dirt they had dug from the trench. We did everything we could to save it from oblivion. We stuck on top of it a rude cross made of 2 pieces of wood, next to which we planted a bottle, neck down, containing a piece of paper with his name written on it. But we knew that a couple of shells landing nearby would soon make an end of it, and the name Mondes would live on only in our memories. At the forward post where we had just spent the night, a fatal accident had occurred. The whole half-section was there, 2 squads. While one squad rested, the other stood guard. Around midnight, a shell landed near the forward post, and a man from the 14th Squad took a piece of shrapnel in the heart and fell dead without saying a word. We hardly knew him. He had arrived with the latest reinforcements. It was his first and last front-line duty. The war was over for him. On June 14th, the Germans concentrated their fire right on the zone where we were. Several times we had to flee violent bombardments, running here and there like the damned chased by devils. At one point I proposed that we go to the forward post where we had spent the night. Maybe, I said, there's less shelling up there. Only 2 comrades agreed to go along with me, but we were no safer there than anywhere else. The artilleries of both sides fixed their sights on the front lines, their shells intermingled right among the forward posts. When we arrived, the 3 of us were surprised to see a man on his knees, a rosary in his hands. It was Corporal Marty of the 14th Squad. Highly devout, he had come alone to await death in repentance and prayer. He too had a premonition of his imminent death. His days were numbered. At nightfall, the whole squad got together again. While I was up at the forward post, a shell had wounded Ferry in the leg. Having staunched his wound with his own supply of bandages, he made his way to the first aid station. In him, the squad lost a steady, thoughtful soldier, on whom you could count in any situation. Robust and courageous, he was a hard worker. I was sorry not to be able to shake his hand when he left. Finally, at 10 o'clock that evening, the 1st Battalion of Chasseurs à Pied came to our relief. After 6 hours of marching, we reached Barlin-le-Mine at 4 in the morning on June 15th. There they billeted us by squads in the red brick houses of the miners, who gave us a decent welcome. Angres-Laurette sector, Barlin-les-Mines, Saint-Zongohel, Halt, Verda. A shell lands in the midst of the 13th Squad. We didn't come to Barlin in order to rest. It was only to fill up empty places in our ranks, to restore ourselves with powerful reinforcements waiting patiently for us. It was the army of retreads and peacetime auxiliaries, whom they were bringing up to take their turn at being massacred. In our company we needed 100 men, because nearly half the company was missing at the first roll call. They didn't make a deal about the total number of losses for the whole regiment, but almost all the companies had suffered as many as we had, if not worse. We spent only 24 hours at Berlin, just the time necessary to incorporate the new recruits and to equip them with cartridges, grenades, tools, field kitchens, etc. And during the night of June 15-16, they brought us back up to the firing line. At dawn, they halted us at the workers' quarters of the mines at Saint-Longueuil. In the streets of this neighbourhood, they made us form up in clusters, as if they had no idea what to do with us. We had to stay in place for several hours, prohibited from wandering off. In a neighbouring company, a man was bold enough to criticise out loud this uncertainty of our leaders, and cried out, "I think we're being led by idiots." A tattletale sergeant brought these irreverent words to the attention of Captain Barbier, commanding that company. The soldier was arrested and brought before a court-martial, which gave him a suspended 2-year prison sentence and transferred him to another regiment. This was Private Paul Comps from Trauss. Finally, we received the order to billet by squad in the corons of the miners, but at high alert, ready to move out at a moment's notice. This seemed inconceivable to us, given our state of extreme fatigue. But our big bosses, in their blind and stupid presumption, believed that the German front facing us would melt away, and we had to be ready for pursuit. Saint-Longueuil, a few years ago, was nothing but an insignificant little farming village. Now there was, surrounding the mine, a vast estate with hundreds of quaint little houses lined up, all identical, surrounded by spacious gardens, separated by wide lanes. It presented the vision of the new city dreamed of by the socialists. But as I explained to my comrades, these habitations were the property of a few arrogant capitalists, and in order to live there you had to be a wage slave in the mine. Despite the town and the mine being in full view and in close range of the German artillery, no shells had been falling on Saint-Longueuil. While we were there, a big caliber one did fall nevertheless. Why this one shell, and not 2, 3, or a dozen? A question which only the German gunners could answer. On June 24th, the regiment got orders to move up to the trenches. The 13th Squad was back to full strength. To replace the wounded comrades Lardos and Ferry and the dead Mondis, we welcomed Privates François Ventresque from Rieux-Minervois, Favier from Saint-Frichou, and Pellissier from La Palme. At about 11 p.m. we reached our reserve position. It was a communication trench built up with mine timbers and earth, which was fine, but you couldn't stretch out to sleep without being trampled by the dainty feet of the poilus passing by in large numbers, because this boyau was the route of access to the front lines. We were available for all kinds of work details, and half the night had not passed before we were called up for some sort of nocturnal task. On June 25th, a violent storm having unleashed a torrential rain onto our trenches, the following night was completely devoted to bailing out the water with shrimping nets, an exhausting chore. To relieve us from these fatiguing duties, on June 28th at 8 p.m., they sent us up to the front line, about 700 or 800 metres away, a distance which we could normally cover in a half hour. This time it took us 5 hours. Had the Germans been warned about this relief, or was it a simple coincidence? Whatever the cause, the communication trenches that we were following were bombarded heavily until midnight. It resulted in halts, pullbacks, gaps in our column. Our half-section was lost, mixed up with other units which were no more sure of where they were going than we were. Nevertheless, we were lucky enough to finally reach our company, deployed at the front line. They positioned us a bit to the rear. Since it was our turn to be reserve, they were considerate enough to let us rest that night, stretched out on the ground in the boyau. The 3 Bleus rookies of the squad were completely exhausted. The artillery barrages which we had to cross, the shells falling nearby, the blinding bursts of flares, the constant drumming of bullets, the explosions of grenades at the advance posts, all this had completely terrorized them. And the old hands amused themselves by frightening them all the more, by making them crouch down, scramble along, hit the ground, while repeating, "This is nothing, you haven't seen anything." The 3 unfortunate ones had to be wondering what it would be like when something big happened. When day broke, we saw with horror that we were in a place completely overturned by recent bombardments. Here and there, broken rifles, shredded knapsacks, shapeless debris, and alas, some dead bodies, all made a tableau which was hardly reassuring. At about 3 in the afternoon, a big shell landed in the boyau, brushing right past 2 periacoas, gills, and allard. The ground trembled, and we saw a huge bunch of earth thrown up more than 4 meters into the air. With failing hearts and frazzled nerves, we awaited the brutal explosion which would tear us all to pieces. But all that landed on our heads was a harmless shower of pulverized earth. The shell hadn't exploded, which happened sometimes, and it ploughed deep into the ground. Half the squad, seized with fear, had fled, and soon came back. It was no safer anywhere else than where we were. In the boyau lay a fully loaded haversack, which no doubt belonged to the poor soldier, yesterday full of life, today frightfully mutilated, whom we saw a few steps away. Rolled up on top of this haversack was a good pair of corduroy trousers, which I appropriated without scruple. The time for wasting materials had not yet arrived, and my own trousers were torn in many places, so right there I undertook an exchange of pants. Then we opened the haversack. Perhaps we would discover the name of its owner. Indeed, it contained a pile of postcards and letters, all in the name of Labucari. What? Labucari was dead. The poor bastard. Everyone in the regiment knew him. He was famous for all kinds of eccentricities, his colourful clothing, the songs he made up and sang in the cabarets, always arousing wild laughter. Fulfilling a duty, we gave the letters and his military papers to our rationer, Therese, to give to the sergeant major of the 23rd Company, to which the dead man belonged. The sergeant major was quite surprised, because at this very moment Labucari was in the bloom of health, as much as one could be in the trenches. When questioned, the walking corpse had to explain how his haversack had fallen into our hands. He was forced to admit that he had abandoned the trench after a violent bombardment. That was all it took for him to be sent up for a court-martial. From that day on, Labucari had it in for me, for 2 reasons. First of all, for having brought all these troubles upon him, and then for having taken his corduroy trousers. Back to our precarious situation. That night, the 13th Squad was called out to dig a trench where the front line no longer existed, having been completely obliterated by bombardments. We had to re-establish it for at least 100 meters. It had been the scene of combats, of attacks and counter-attacks, and the ground was strewn with corpses and all sorts of debris. We had to put our picks and shovels to work in the middle of a charnel house. When they heard what kind of work we had to do, the 3 replacements, newcomers in our ranks, grew faint with fear. I took it upon myself to leave them behind, in our redoubt. At night, their absence would easily pass unnoticed. At 9 p.m., about 40 of us followed Sub-Lieutenant Malvesi, who deployed us along the line we had to trace. It was a very dark night, when maps and compasses were of no use. Instinct alone was our guide. But it guided us falsely this time. Those who were right up front with the lieutenant ran smack into the German trench. We knew about it only when the enemy sentries, probably more frightened than we were, shouted in their guttural voices, "Halt! Wer da? Who goes there? Halt! Wer da?" For us it was pandemonium, mindless flight, with no one having any idea where the French lines were. Bullets whistled around us, some grenades burst. We plunged into shell holes, but they got crowded fast. Everywhere men were flattened on the ground. Our squad had scattered. "Hey you, over there, what company?" "And you, what about you? Are you in the 21st? These questions went unanswered because they were all addressed to dead comrades. What a slaughter! I speak for my fellow survivors of the 13th Squad, my friends Taut, Allard, Gills, when I say that nowhere, not even at Verdun, did we see such a deadly harvest of souls than in those few minutes. And all this virile youth, why was it sacrificed there? To take or retake a few lousy square meters of shell holes? How long were we going to stay in this graveyard? Wouldn't this alert unleash a bombardment which could last all night? An uninterrupted rain of shell fire? Luckily, nothing of the kind took place. Soon, all was calm. We rallied and took up the work that had been assigned to us. The next morning, the only one missing from our squad was our pal Taut, about whose fate we all worried. But later in the day we had the pleasure of seeing him arrive back, with all his limbs intact. When all hell had broken loose the night before, he had leaped into a shell hole where other comrades had already sought refuge. He saw right away that he was surrounded by dead men. Terrified, he bolted like a madman and landed in a trench full of Moroccan tirailleurs, sharpshooters, who were ready to cut his head off without a second thought. This day was marked by violent bombardments on our lines. Slumped in our boyo, we were completely numbed by the incessant rolling of thunderbolts. In the 21st Company, there were men wounded and killed. Among the latter, a comrade named Bigu. It was with real joy that we went up to the front line that evening. Joy to be getting away from that accursed boyo. Joy to not be going to work on the trench we'd begun the night before. In the latest offensive, the French had reached the village, but a counter-attack had pushed them back to the point where we were. In the plain beyond Angres, you could see, uninterrupted, the corons and the high smokestacks of Liévin, and farther on, those of Lens. That night and the next one, July 1st, passed without incident. I noted that we were in front of Angres, just a few hundred meters away. In this sector there were no listening posts. Sentries were posted 3 or 4 paces from one another. By half-section, one squad was on guard, the other rested. During the night of July 1st too, our trench was going to be bloodied. In our half-section, 15 men were going to be killed or wounded in the following circumstances.